Welcome everyone to our conversation with this year's Llewellyn, John, and Harriet Manchester Quantrell Award winners in the social sciences and the humanities. Let me first introduce Miguel Martínez, who is a colleague, an associate professor in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures, where he teaches in the Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian section, and he is a scholar of early modern Spanish Iberian literature, and he'll tell us a little bit about himself. But Jim, do you want to introduce?
Yes. And I'd like to introduce Susan Gal, who is the May and Sidney G. Metzel Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology, Linguistics, and of the Social Sciences in the college. Sue, first I should begin by congratulating you on this award. It's a highly prized award among the faculty, and the students are also very keen to see who the winner is each year. So I'd like to open with a question about a course that came up in one of the nominations from the students. You teach a course on empire and nation. It's very highly regarded by the students. Can you talk a little bit about what the course is about and what kinds of surprises and unexpected insights you think are available to us by thinking about the continuities between empire and nation?
Well, thank you. First, let me say that I'm delighted by winning this award. It's very unexpected, and I think that it's just, it's great. It made me very happy, partly because it's through the students, but in general, it's a very old award at the university, has a great tradition. So about the course, I think that scholars used to think that nation and empire were quite different from each other, in fact, sort of opposed. And I think the more recent thinking has been that they're very much related, not just because one may grow out of the other, but also because one often hides under the other. So that, for instance, for a long time, as you, Jim, know very well, American nationalism actually took the form of a denied kind of imperialism in the world. And I think that the relationship is a really important one. The fact that nations are not often sovereign, for instance, is something that students don't always know. So one of the things that the course tries to do is to look at the place of the United States in the question of nation versus empire, and nation growing out of empire, and empire growing out of nation. But also, because it's an anthropology course, one of the things Anthro does so well is to unpack concepts. So what is a nation at all? We don't take it for granted. And of course, what is empire, and colonialism always comes into it. So that's one sort of basic form of thinking in the course. But for me, more interesting than that, or as you say, possibly surprising, is that we bring in religion. But that's not surprising anymore. We all know that nationalism and religion might have something to do with each other. But maybe gender is more surprising. The idea that gender is related to nation and empire, and gender and sex in all sorts of different ways. Just as an example, reproduction, which is clearly a matter of gender and sex, turns out to be hugely important to nationhood. We think of it as a personal thing, kinship too, right? But in fact, it turns out that nations and states have huge stakes in how many people are born, what kind of people, according to the categories that nations set up, what kind of people are born. And then sexuality and gender also make a difference in forms of citizenship around the world. Who can and cannot be a citizen? Are sex and gender taken into consideration in that? How are there intersections between religion and gender? For instance, we do a lot of discussion about the veiling controversies in Europe. Why is it that the question of nationalism and exclusion falls on young girls in schools about whether or not they wear scarves? So I think that might be a bit of a surprise to students when they come to that class. I think I'll mention one other thing, which has to do with feelings, affect. I'm very interested myself in how is it that nation affect, patriotism we might call it, nationalism, how is that created? How is it that we're made to feel it? And one of the things that we do in class is discuss that very strongly.
Well, I know I want to give Chris and Miguel a chance to talk, but I just want to follow up with a quick question about that, which is that in the US, American nationalism was built out of anti-imperial sentiment and assumptions. And so, so the continental empire and then global empire was built through a language, a nationalist language that denied, that was sort of categorically opposed. Does that make it difficult for American students to at first understand the proposition, the sort of intellectual proposition of recognizing these continuities? Are they
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think less so in these last few years as the insights that you mentioned have become much more popularly brooded about. But I think that over the years, I've taught this course for quite a while. Yes, there was a time in which nationalism could not even be applied to the United States. Right? We had patriotism, not nationalism. Right? I'm sure you remember that. But I think you're absolutely right that continuity of claiming nationalism but practicing imperialism, on the one hand, claiming anti-imperialism as in the founding fathers, right? Yeah. Anti-colonialism. But at the same time, not so many years later in the history of the United States, the conquest of the West, as an imperial enterprise, the attempted conquest of Central America as an imperial enterprise, all under the aegis of nationhood. Right? So yes, I think this is not easy for students to get, but they do.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Let me start, Miguel, also to congratulate you. As Jim mentioned, you're now part of a very select group of outstanding teachers in the college. I, of course, have a number of questions prepared, but I wanted to actually piggyback on the empire and nation. You're, of course, scholar of, or Spain was a part of the Habsburg Empire, and it famously claimed that the sun never sets in the Habsburg Empire. So I'm just curious, how does an empire, at least, and maybe also nationhood factor into your teaching and research?
Well, first of all, thank you, Chris. I'm truly honored for the award, and it's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk to you guys about our teaching. So, nation and empire, when you teach Spain, both of them are, of course, you can imagine, incredibly relevant, but in a very interesting way, because Spain is, of course, a post-imperial nation, right? That not always has recognized its post-imperial condition. On the other hand, Spain is a nation that is, I mean, some people would say that is really badly made. There's many people in Spain who think that there's more than one nation in Spain, and many Catalans, many people from the Basque Country, many people from Galicia feel so, speaking about affect, right? So we have a national flag that many people even don't feel represented by. So it is, I mean, it is difficult actually, and this is something that comes up in the classroom, because for many people in Spain or in Europe, actually it shocks them the way American nationalism or patriotism has worked historically, and it's looked at with a mix of, envy or, respect and deference, and at the same time, a little bit, reticence, I would say, right? Precisely because of the kind of affect it seems to elicit from people. But I mean, I work and teach mostly the early modern period. And another interesting thing would be that, I mean, I teach both Iberian materials, right? Iberian cultural materials, but also a little bit of literature and other things produced in colonial Latin America. But it is also interesting that the empire didn't seem to have an incredibly weighty, right, cultural impact in the kind of literature that was produced in Spain. This has puzzled some scholars. For instance, if you think of the Golden Age, what we call Golden Age drama, right? people have studied, for instance, the representations of America, representations of the New World in Spanish drama. And of course there are, but it's surprising, you know, thinking from our privileged, retrospective, you know, modern perspective, how little there is. It of course has to do with the Eurocentrism and with many other things, but that's actually something that you need to explain in the classroom, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So like you, I teach in a language department. And so I'm just curious, how do you tackle some of the challenges of teaching texts in a foreign language? Why do you think teaching and learning a foreign language is important? And what is your advice to students about learning a foreign language?
That's a great question, Chris. So, I mean, we are in languages departments, but I think we all try to teach language and culture and literature in as an integrated way as possible, right? Every language learner knows that there's no real linguistic competence without cultural competence. I mean, you don't even have to travel very far for that. You just have to walk down to the next non-English speaking neighborhood, right? So the first thing I would say is that language teaching is actually integrated in a very concrete sense with the teaching of culture and literature. Also, in the I would also say that, I mean, there's really interesting ways in which teaching language can also help in the classroom to teach culture and literature. I find, for instance, translation as an incredible tool to use in a literature classroom, because it's actually a kind of a Trojan horse for doing close reading. There's no better close reading than the one that the translator actually has to do to fully understand the text and convey its meaning, right? So I found that very useful as a teaching strategy in the classroom. And again, it's a very, I would hope, you know, integrated way of teaching both. I would also say that, I mean, language learning, or why you were asking, Chris, why is it important? It is important, of course, first of all, because it's very useful for life and for your professional career. But it is also, you know, I like to tell students that there's a very crucial, fundamental, substantial difference between being a critical thinker, a monolingual critical thinker, or a multilingual or bilingual critical thinker. You know, because first of all, because the kind of access it gives you to different traditions, but also because of the distance it gives you with your own culture and language. But maybe finally, I would say that, you know, in our case, in Romance languages, and particularly in Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian studies, students in our classrooms keep reminding us that Spanish is not really a foreign language in the US. So that adds another very interesting component to the way we teach to both non-native and native bilingual speakers of the language. How we teach everything, literature, culture, and language, to all those different kinds of students.
You know, I have a question that connects to this exchange between Chris and Miguel, Sue, but it's also relevant to Miguel, so I hope you'll both answer it. So Sue, your language is a major focus of your research and teaching, and many of your students are also multilingual. And so I wondered if you could speak to this point about, you know, the significance of engaging multiple languages, not only English, in the classroom, and get at this question of what is it about thinking in another language that opens up new horizons. And to put a little edge on it, I'd like to ask a bit polemically, what do we lose when we let artificial intelligence take care of the translation?
Oh, well, I think I should start, and thanks for that question. It really is what I work on. So I couldn't agree more with everything that Miguel just said, and including the fact that the United States is a massively multilingual place, that which multilingualism of which is constantly denied, suppressed, and in many ways the attempt is made to erase it from not just our consciousness, but actually our students' consciousness. So I teach many courses in which many of the students, the majority I would say, come from multilingual families, but they need to have their consciousness raised about the significance of that. Maybe by the time they get to Miguel's class, that's no longer the case. They know what they have. But it's a really wonderful experience for me to say, look, this is a value. And to discuss the way it is, and the fact that there are many, many places in the world where it is understood to be a value, that the United States is actually an outlier in suppressing multilingualism in the world. And since anthropology is always about comparison among different cultures and cultural practices in the world, this is very helpful. But what you asked about is what difference it makes in the classroom. And I wanted to say a word that about what it is that I actually love to teach about, which is that although the language itself, that is the grammatical stuff, the phonological patterns, is important. Of course, it's indispensable. But what I find to be most interesting is that you never teach a language, you teach a form of interaction. Because one of the things that's a problem for the translator, as Miguel said, is exactly to try somehow to find an equivalent of the form of interaction that either in a novel, in a work of art, or in actual face-to-face contact. What is it that happens in that interaction? Whether it's in one language or another, or whether it's in multiple languages, because interactions in multiple languages are everywhere in the world. Right? So even the keeping languages separate as different objects is something that is accomplished as a sociocultural project, often a state and nation-led, to get back to the other question you asked me, project. And it's that interactional aspect of language, that's where you have questions like, how do we persuade each other? How do we make each other trust each other? How do we gain authority about what we say? And those turn out to be political questions. So that's the kind of thing I'm really interested in. How do you create authority in an interaction? Because of course, mass mediated talk is also interaction with some audience. And how to put this, AI doesn't do that. So I think it's really important that although many, many important steps have been made in translating through artificial intelligence, for instance, or research through searching through texts with the help of AI. What I've just described to you is that nexus of culture as understood through interaction and language as used in interaction, which has really significant patterns that vary across space and time. That is something that has not been captured by AI. Now, I'm not saying it can't be, but as we stand now, that is not there. I mean, that makes it difficult to do research with the richness and depth that you would want while using only AI tools.
I don't know if Miguel wants to chime in on that point.
Wow, you said so many things. So maybe I'll just add something to what Sue was saying about, because I really love this idea of you don't teach a language or even a culture, you teach a form of interaction. And I would just add from my point of view, you know, how very traditional, very classic literary analysis questions or cultural historical questions might also help students understand that, right? When you look at a text and you say, okay, who wrote this, under which circumstances, what is the, how does this particular text build a public for itself? How is an inquisitorial testimony elicited from some kind, you know, from some subject that is being prosecuted? I mean, these are very basic questions that speak that are very relevant to what Sue's saying about how do you teach forms of interaction? How do you teach how do you also use, for instance, literature to teach about the pragmatics of communication in a very large cultural sense, right?
And if I may add genres, I mean, the Inquisition, how do you do an Inquisition? Not that we want to know.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that Sue said several times, and Miguel, that you picked up, and that's sort of that one of a really important pedagogical technique is defamiliarization. And that's where I feel also foreign language becomes actually foreign language pedagogy becomes sort of a productive way of defamiliarizing what students think they already always know. And you were talking about empire and nation and things, you know, and of course, when you teach English texts, students feel that they know the language and they are often not, you know, they don't, aren't puzzled by things that they should be puzzled about. So, which brings me to my next question, namely that, you know, you mentioned you're a cultural and literary historian of early modern Europe, which is also my period. You know, as the name indicates, it's the cradle of modernity. And so in many ways, that's where many things that we, you know, whether it's modern science have, you know, sort of their moment of birth. But on the other hand, it's also a period of enormous experimentation, of paths not taken, that is very unfamiliar to us. And I wonder how you just sort of go about teaching the period that you're clearly very excited about because you're devoting your life's research to it. You know, how do you bring that closer to students, but then also not lose that moment that is productive in teaching?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. It is precisely, that's the key question, I believe, actually, to teach the kind of materials we teach, is that very delicate balance between, you know, bridging the cultural and historical distance from these materials, because that's what you're supposed to do as a teacher, right? And at the same time, using that estrangement and that you know, that unfamiliarity of these materials for the students, that, as you said, has an incredible pedagogical potential, right? So that balance is always that you don't want to make our ancestors look too much like us, right? But at the same time, there's a reason why you call them your ancestors. So, I mean, that's always a very delicate balance. There's an added, since you're talking about modernity, there's an added interesting component, you know, in the traditions from which I come from and that I teach, which is that in many Spanish-speaking traditions, modernity actually starts in 1492. And that is how departments are structured, that's how curricula are structured, and the disciplines, right? Mm-hmm. Which of course brings us back to what we were talking about before, about, you know, the legacies of slavery and colonialism to these days. I mean, at the same time you teach the legacies of slavery and colonialism, you can also teach resilience and cultural resistance. So that is also another way of bridging, right, both periods. I'm just thinking of an interesting moment we had in a class I taught in the winter on the picaresque novel. And students were actually puzzled, and this is a very specific instance of what you're saying, by how in this kind of realistic narrative tradition that we've come to call picaresque, that normally starts with a child being thrown basically into the real world, totally destitute, in poverty, and, you know, basically he or she has to survive in this very cruel world. Students were puzzled by the idea that there was no childhood back in that period. They kept asking questions. How is it possible that a mother throws her child, right, to a cruel real world like that? So that prompted very interesting discussions about how nothing, not even something that seems to be biologically determined, you know, such as childhood, there's nothing natural about it. It's actually a historical conquest, we would say. It's actually some kind of collective victory, you know, the way we've come in some places to make arrangement to actually protect childhood, right? So that's the kind of things, that's the puzzlement moment, right? But then I feel lucky to teach early modern Iberian literatures in particular, because at the same time, you know, it's really easy to teach Cervantes or Lope de Vega. I mean, they teach themselves because they are so, you know, such beautiful and powerful texts that there's also, you know, students see that connection. I mean, can connect to those texts in relatively, easily, I would say. But I think I've talked too much.
Yeah, I'm curious, Sue, what I would imagine that, or I know that anthropology, has extensively thought about precisely this interplay between the familiar and the unfamiliar, between distance and proximity. And I just wondered how that, plays into your teaching, but also, of course, just simply, into your work.
Oh, thanks for asking that, because as I was listening to Miguel, I was saying, yes, yes, yes. Indeed, that's what we do. I really feel that my own experience has been that I got really turned on by anthropology when I first studied it in college. I had never even heard of it until then. And I thought, oh my God, look at this weird world that we live in. Look at all the amazing things that people make out of what seems, as Miguel said, natural phenomena, right, for us, but they aren't at all. They are constructed as cultural phenomena. And it was just, I was totally fascinated by it. And in classrooms, I insist that we always read at least 2, often 3 ethnographies. That is, book-length descriptions, hopefully by someone who knows how to write well, of fieldwork experiences, of getting to know another cultural context deeply enough to be able to write about it at length, to write about and to relate it to our own issues, in other words, the ones in the United States at the moment or in some historical moment. So yes, the question of what is naturalized, how to unnaturalize it, for students to understand that they themselves are involved in making the things that they take for granted as naturally existing phenomena, naturally existing categories often. I mean, race and gender are the ones that are now at the top of our priority list, but there are lots of other ones. I'm interested in things like magic and religion, what counts as honor and shame, what counts as responsibility and individuality. I mean, these are the kinds of categories that are vastly different across cultural contexts. And yeah, you don't bridge it. You say, look at that, and now look at yourself. And as Miguel says, if the discussion of the other is in fact persuasive and beautiful, then that bridge can be, that connection can be made.
So can I just ask you, if a student wanted to, you have your aha experience of college, could you recommend an ethnography? I'm putting you on the spot, for their summer reading?
Yes, I've been thinking about that. I would recommend a book that's partly history, partly anthropology, and it's entitled Silencing the Past, by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who died recently, but he was a member of our department. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and it's about both the history and the present of Haiti. And in fact tries in the text itself to connect Haiti to European and American race relations over a considerable amount of time, but is also ethnographic. So it's a wonderful book. I recommend it. Yes, and also readable, really readable.
So when I hear you, let me, Jim, I'm sorry to. When I hear you talk, it sounds like Sue, you're really a historian of the present, and Miguel is, so to say, an anthropologist of the part. But in many ways, your teaching and your research is very much alike in the way that you approach phenomena.
Right. Right.
Well, so the follow-up question for Miguel on this then would be, even if your work is, you're immersed in the early modern period, can you point us to any works of contemporary culture, whether it's a play, an opera, a novel, a movie, that has picaresque elements that we might not have realized, but would be profitable for us to attend to?
Well, first of all, I would also recommend Trouillot's book. It's an amazing one.
Oh, that's great.
That's an easy way out. But no, okay. So I mean, the picaresque. I mean, it's a very long tradition. It became an international tradition. You know, in that course, I also taught a work of contemporary TV fiction that I really liked a lot. The problem is I don't think it can be seen in the US. It's called La Peste, meaning the plague. And I taught that before that the course happened before the pandemic, which is kind of scary to think about, you know, how we were talking about the plague right before the global pandemic struck us, right? But that is an incredible work of TV fiction that draws heavily from the picaresque tradition. And of course, there's many contemporary novels, etc. I recently read a novel by a Mexican writer that is actually very, very picaresque. The title is kind of ugly to say here, but it's called Corazón de Mierda, which means like shit heart or something like that.
Well, I think we've come up to our time, and I want to thank you both for a rich conversation, but even more for the extraordinary dedication that you both have shown in the classroom. It's just so central to the life of the mind here at the University of Chicago.
Yes, let me also thank you, and thank you for giving our students a little bit of insight of how you think about teaching and about your work, and it's been really exciting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.